afternoon, U.S. history students. We are going to get started on chapter 15. Before we get started on chapter 15, I want to highly suggest to you, really encourage, that you take a few minutes, it may take you a couple hours, and read or at least skim the chapters that we skipped. Now, if you don't have time, or you're like, oh, Ms. Hanson, I'm a really slow reader, then I would recommend that you at least skim chapter 13, which is the chapter on the South. That's page 414 to 428, and that you read chapter 14, section 4, which is page 454 to page 460. If you don't do anything else, reading those will give you some background. We did have to skip just because we're running out of time, and I get so involved when I'm teaching sometimes that I forget that I've got to go at a certain pace, and really wanted to end the year. Sort of the Civil War is a good place to kind of divide American history, and so we're going to skip to 15, but like I said, I'll try to throw in some of the background that you may have missed, but do go back and at least look over those chapters in a skimming kind of way. So, chapter 15, A Divided Nation. This is where it gets rough, it gets hard. The question of slavery has been a question since the very beginning. I mean, you'll remember, us talking about that in the Three-Fifths Compromise, and how slavery was an issue from the very beginning of our nation's history. One of the problems that came up is that the U.S. added a lot of land when they won the Mexican-American War in 1848. A lot of land. More than 500,000 square miles. More than 500,000 square miles. And this kind of brought the debate about slavery up again. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had divided the Louisiana Purchase into either free or slave regions. So slavery north of latitude 3630 was prohibited, but the Missouri Compromise of 1820 allowed Missouri to become a slave state. In the 1840s, President James K. Polk, who was president number 11, wanted to extend that line all the way to the West Coast. But there was a problem. What this would do was divide the Mexican cession. That's what they called all of the land that the U.S. received from Mexico in the Mexican-American War. It would divide the Mexican cession into, again, free in the north and slave in the south. There were a couple of issues with that. The first was the idea of popular sovereignty. I forgot to write things on the board before I started, so popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea that political power belongs to the people, and so the people of each state should decide if they want to be free or slave. There were some regional differences here, of course. There were Northerners who wanted to outlaw slavery completely in the entire Mexican cession. In fact, during the war there was a man named David Wilmot who offered something he called the Wilmot Proviso. And this stated, and I'm going to quote it, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall ever exist in any part of the territory." So he wanted to completely outlaw slavery in all of this new land. Now, the House of Representatives was controlled by Northerners, and so, of course, the Wilmot Proviso passed that House. But the Senate was not controlled by Northerners. In the Senate, the South had a lot more power, so the Wilmot Proviso didn't pass in the Senate. Now, prior to this period of history, politicians usually supported the ideas of their political parties, and we see that a lot today. But the Wilmot Proviso spurred a debate that really started showing some cracks along sort of these ideological fault lines that we had in our nation. And those fault lines were along sectional lines. And in fact, this was called sectionalism. Let's talk about that. Sectionalism was the idea that the interests of one section or region of the country should be favored over another section or another region of the country. The Democrats and the Whigs were trying to attract voters, and so they decided to not take a clear position on slavery in the presidential campaign of 1848. Look, we don't want to offend people that are for slavery. We don't want to offend people that are against it, so we're not going to take a stand on it. And in response to that, there were Northerners who were very much anti-slavery, who began a party called the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party was in support completely of the Wilmot Proviso for a couple of different reasons. First, they were worried that slave labor meant there would be less work for white workers. Not exactly the anti-slavery can't think of the word. Anyway, not quite the anti-slavery we were hoping for, right? But they chose Martin Van Buren as their candidate. They won 10% of the popular vote. That 10% that they won drew away votes from Lewis Cass, who was the Democratic nominee, and because of that, the Whig candidate, Zachary Taylor, won the election. He is number 12, president number 12. Zachary Taylor was a retired Army officer, and his nickname in the Mexican-American War was Old Rough and Ready, and he was elected president of the United States. Now, we've got some problems in California. So, the California Gold Rush, which if you have read the chapters in between, if you read chapter 11 through chapter 14, you will know about the California Gold Rush. The California Gold Rush caused a lot of population growth in California. So much population growth that California wanted to join the Union as a state instead of a territory. But we've got another problem. Would California enter as a free state or a slave state? Because if you remember that line, 3630, that cut across the U.S., would cut right across the middle of California. Most Californians opposed slavery. Slavery was illegal when California was part of Mexico. And most of the 49ers, the men that had come to mine for gold, most of the 49ers were from free states. But if California became a state as a free state, then the balance in the Senate would be out of balance once again, the Southerners were absolutely against that. They were not willing to accept this imbalance. In fact, Senator Jefferson Davis of Mississippi said we're about to permanently destroy the balance of power between the sections. Senator Jefferson Davis, there's a name you need to remember if you don't already know him. Right now, he is a senator from Mississippi. But it's not going to take us very long before he'll no longer be a senator from Mississippi and he'll be the president of the Confederate States of America. So keep your eye on Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis, along with other Southerners, absolutely did not want California to enter the U.S. as a free state. So our good friend Henry Clay, you remember Henry Clay? Known as, oops, I can't spell and talk at the same time. I should know better than to try. Our good friend Henry Clay, the great compromiser, had one more compromise left in him. Right. Henry Clay had helped settle the Missouri crisis of 1819 and 1820. He helped navigate the nullification crisis of 1832 and 1833, and he did both of those things by proposing compromises. One more plan, the Compromise of 1850. Now, on your study guide, you'll see the word secede. I have that out of order. Secede needs to be after Compromise of 1850. We're going to talk about the compromise, and we're going to talk about secede, and then we're going to talk about the compromise again. Okay? So, the Compromise of 1850. Write that up here. And let's do that in a different color so that we know it's not the same thing. Compromise of 1850. Now, if you look on page 478 in your book, you will see a list, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things, the Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850, California would enter the Union as a free state. The rest of the Mexican cession would be federal land, and popular sovereignty would decide whether slavery would be legal or not. The third thing is Texas would give up land east of the upper Rio Grande, and in return for that, the government would pay Texas's debts from when it was an independent republic. In the fourth, the slave trade, but not slavery itself, would end in Washington, D.C., right? So if you already own a slave, you can own a slave, but there will be no slave trade in Washington, D.C. And then fifth, a more effective fugitive slave law would be passed. That was Henry Clay's compromise. There was a lot of disagreement and discussion about this compromise, especially regarding California. There was a senator named William Seward of New York who defended his anti-slavery views, wanted California admitted, quote, directly, without conditions, without qualifications, and without compromise. On the other side of that, you will remember Senator John C. Calhoun. He's a very old man by this time. John C. Calhoun argued that letting California enter as a free state would destroy the nation's balance. And Calhoun, fiery as always, reminded people that there were issues that were a problem, that needed to be solved, and if they weren't solved, things were going to go badly, and those were, in fact, the very issues that would start the Civil War. Calhoun, at this point, asked that the slave states be allowed to secede. This means to formally withdraw from the Union. Want to secede. Daniel Webster was opposed to that. He opposed Calhoun and said, I wish to speak today not as a Massachusetts man, nor as a Northern man, but as an American. I speak today for the preservation of the Union. Hear me for my cause. Webster was critical of Northern abolitionists. Now, abolitionists were people who wanted to, well, they want to abolish something, but in America, when we use the term abolitionist, we are specifically talking about the abolition of slavery, or the doing away of slavery. When you abolish something, you end it, and they wanted to abolish slavery. Daniel Webster criticized Northern abolitionists, and he criticized Southerners who spoke of secession. So that compromise was enacted, and we thought, right, that this settled things. Most of Clay's proposals, most of Henry Clay's proposals were achieved through the Compromise of 1850. So if you look on 479, you see the Compromise of 1850 in bold. California entered the Union as a free state. The Mexican cession was divided into two territories, Utah and New Mexico, where the question of whether you would have slavery or not would be decided by popular sovereignty. Texas agreed to give up its land claims in New Mexico in exchange for financial aid, and slave trade was outlawed in the District of Columbia, and a new fugitive slave law was passed. Let's talk about that. The Fugitive Slave Act. This is pretty crazy stuff. The Fugitive Slave Act made it a crime to help runaway slaves, and it allowed officials to arrest slaves in free areas. If you were a slaveholder, you could take suspected fugitives to U.S. commissioners who would then decide their fate. The Fugitive Slave Act was something else. Slaveholders could use testimony from white witnesses, but if you were an African American and you were accused of being a fugitive, you were not allowed to testify. If you hid or you helped a runaway slave, you faced 6 months in jail and a $1,000 fine. Now that's a lot today. Imagine how much that was in the mid-1800s. If you were a commissioner who rejected a slaveholder's claim, you earned $5. If you returned a fugitive slave, you earned $10. So the commissioners, who were supposed to be fair and impartial, were benefiting monetarily from helping slaveholders. Now, as you can imagine, the reactions to this were pretty, well, they were something else. In September of 1850, federal marshals arrested an African-American man named James Hamlet. They returned him to a slaveholder in Maryland. He had lived in New York City for 3 years. Thousands of African Americans fled to Canada during this time period. In the 10 years after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, 343 fugitive slave cases were reviewed, and the accused were declared free in only, ready for this, 11 of those cases. 11 of those cases. The Fugitive Slave Act made Northerners angry. They were very uncomfortable with the power that these individual commissioners had. They did not like the idea that commissioners had higher fees for returning slaves. That wasn't good. They were absolutely horrified that some free African Americans had captured and been returned south. Most Northerners who opposed the act were peaceful resistors, but there was some violence, as you can imagine. In 1854, a man named Anthony Burns was a fugitive slave from Virginia. He was arrested in Boston. Abolitionists in Boston tried to use force to rescue him from jail. They ended up killing a deputy marshal. A federal ship was ordered to return him to Virginia, and a bunch of people in the North, especially in Massachusetts, were outraged. Absolutely outraged. They were angry. And this incident with Anthony Burns persuaded more people to join the cause of the abolitionists. In addition to that, you have a growing amount of anti-slavery literature. Abolitionists used stories like the stories of James Hamlet and of Anthony Burns to get sympathy. But there were also slave narratives. You probably have not seen the movie 12 Years a Slave. It was made several years ago. It's rated R. It's hard to watch, but it's a true story based on a man's experience as a slave. He was a free African who was captured and accused of being a runaway slave and brought south. And it'll wreck if you watch it. You definitely need parental permission. It's not something that I would recommend to very young people, but eventually you may want to watch it so that you understand a little bit more about what's going on. But there was some fiction that garnered sympathy and gained support of a lot of Northerners and a few Southerners as well. There's nothing like a good story to help people understand things that are going on in their world. And one of the most important was a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a novel written by a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it was very, very anti-slavery. She was the daughter of a Connecticut minister named Lyman Beecher. She moved to Ohio when she was 21, and in Ohio she met fugitive slaves, and she heard about what life under slavery was like, and it made her mad. It made her angry. And, I can't imagine not being angered by that. This idea that people were less because of the color of their skin. She decided to write a book. She wanted to educate Northerners about what slavery was really like, this sort of myth of the happy African slave who's treated well. There were some African slaves who were treated well, but the vast majority of them were not. And even if they were treated well, just the idea of owning another human being is something that I can't get my brain around for sure. Uncle Tom's Cabin was published in 1852. The main character was an enslaved African American named Tom. He's taken from his wife. He's sold down the river in Louisiana. He becomes the slave of a man named Simon Legree, who is this sort of cruel caricature of a slave owner. And in a fit of rage, Simon Legree has Tom beaten to death. This novel set a spark off. Louisa McCord, who was a famous Southern writer, questioned the foul imagination which could invent such scenes. In other words, she's like, you have to be an evil person to be able to even think of these things. But within a decade, over 2 million copies of Uncle Tom's Cabin had been sold in the U.S. 2 million copies. This was a runaway bestseller for the time period. The book's popularity was so impressive that one Northerner said Stowe in her book created 2 million abolitionists. She later wrote a book called A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin to answer people who had criticized her book and where she got her ideas. The impact of her book, I'm not sure it can be underestimated. In fact, there's a story, and our history book talks about it, that a year after the start of the Civil War in 1862, Harriet Beecher Stowe met President Abraham Lincoln, and he said, supposedly, "This is the little lady who made the big war." Her book is still widely read today. It's often required reading in schools as a source of information about the harsh realities of slavery. And this was just the beginning. In our next section, we're going to talk about trouble in Kansas. And if you think this stuff was amazing, wait till you read about what happened in Kansas and all of the things that John Brown did. See you tomorrow.